challenge. So once there is no enforcement, so there is nothing that we can do. Like many people do pledge, like many countries do pledge that these are policies that we are going to implement, but later on fail. So that is one of the biggest challenges. Thank you, madam.
Excellent, excellent contribution. And I would want to say that that is exactly one of the biggest challenges we are having. And you'll see that's one of the reasons why we are having so many global meetings, the gap between rhetoric and action. And I will now go into my slides, but thank you so much for indulging me in that and very good participation. Allow me to now move into the slides where we'll go a little bit into understanding why do we even have to have commitments in the first place? Do we really need other countries to come on board? Do we need to be all together? So I'll start with this. Confirm you can see my slides? Anyone?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we have, you might have heard that we have what is called the 2-degree budget. That is saying that if we we need to ensure that we do not hit 2 degrees of warming of the globe. Currently, the globe has very little left to 1.5 degrees. In fact, they are saying we could have exceeded that a little bit. But by the time the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, we were already at around 1.3. And so there was need for urgent action to be done. So one of the things that we all have consensus on, and I could see even from your responses, is that everybody agrees we have a problem. And that problem is called global warming. The earth has become hotter, and there's no doubt about that. It is being observed everywhere around the globe. And so the question becomes, so then what are the solutions? The issue has been in defining the solution, we come across what are called interests. And someone had said the issue around politics. So there's political interests. You have seen right-wing, left-wing discussions. Some saying I have to be able to make a commitment that does not stop business from happening. Which business? Oil business, does not limit manufacturing using coal. There's also the issue around economic interests. So countries like in Africa, we have quite a number that have discovered oil. Kenya discovered, for instance, coal the other a few years back. Do we go about mining that coal, or should we leave it in the ground in the interest of ensuring that we are politically aligned and aligned with global ambitions? We also have sociocultural interests that come into play in negotiations. So you found discussions amongst like indigenous and local communities who are saying, you know, we think the land should stay as it is. Don't bring wind farms. Don't do radical changes. You have to be in tandem with nature. And these are some of the things that get into the play when we are discussing solutions. And then, of course, there's the issue of sovereignty. Do we have a right to impose something on another country that is sovereign? So that has been the complexity when it comes to global governance of climate change. All these interests come into play, despite us understanding a similar the problem and framing the problem in a similar manner. So if you look at the image on the side, if we were in class, I'd have asked how many of you have seen a number 6. It can be a number 6 or it can be a number 9, depending on where you are, isn't it? Just because you're right, it doesn't mean that another is wrong. It's just that you haven't seen from my position. If I'm standing down on the tail end, it will look like a number 9. On the other side, it will look like a number 6. So we are seeing a problem and we're also seeing solution, but are they from the same perspective? This is some of the underlying philosophy when it comes to climate change. All in all, we know that, you know, it's about emissions. It has been confirmed scientifically that climate change has been caused because of increase in emissions, especially from fossil fuels that are heavy in carbon. And therefore, when burnt, they result in greenhouse gas emissions. And this becomes an issue that is very sensitive because it is linked with politics. Burning fossil fuels is really linked with industrialization, which is linked with economic prosperity. In many countries, that's the pathway that has been done for many years. And therefore, when you bring up this issue on emission reduction, there is going to be a sensitivity from both developing and developed countries. Many of you have listened to the declarations being made in the US right now that are saying, some of you have heard Trump saying statements like, drill, baby, drill. It is extremely sensitive. And for developing nations, while developed countries are also trying to secure the economic gains they have had over time, developing nations are also trying to be able to develop. And in that sense, they need to industrialize. And the cost of energy becomes a very, very material question. How are we able to industrialize with expensive energy when we have energy that has high calorific value, able to be used for production that is being limited in terms of emission reduction? So in this regard, the globe had to come together to find consensus. And that's the discourse that I will be touching on today. It's about how do we, on one hand, have very strong evidence base through science and confirmed numbers. And then on the other hand, how are we able to bring people together, countries together, to agree on the way forward? So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was established in 1988 to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments, and they become the knowledge base and evidence base on matters climate change. When, on the other hand, there has to be negotiations that happen that agree on goals that are collective. And this was through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that became the International Environmental Treaty that was adopted in 1992 and entered into force in 1994. The UNFCCC, as we commonly know it, became the agreement around how can we stabilize greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere to prevent anthropogenic man-made interference to the climate system. And that is where a lot of consensus happens. So UNFCCC became the mechanism through which parties would come together to agree on the way forward. I don't know why my slide isn't changing. So that discussion, that the UNFCCC discourse, the UNFCCC treaty was signed came into force in 1994, but we've had a number of significant timelines that I'll be touching on even in the slides, but this is just to give you a snapshot so that you can know what to expect. In 2001, there was consensus around the need for adaptation, the need to be able to build resilience to climate change and address vulnerabilities, and this is through national adaptation plans. And this was agreed in Marrakesh in 2001. And then we had the third COP, that is it the third COP? I feel like that's a typo, sorry. COP 13 that happened in Kyoto. And here is where there was adoption of needs to be binding targets on emission reduction to ensure that industrialized countries can limit their emissions. And this one is very important to note that this target was specifically for industrialized countries, given that they were the ones who were found to be largely responsible for emissions. That was in Japan, Kyoto. And then in Cancun, in 2010, the NAP process was established, and this gave birth to the adaptation framework process. And in Doha in 2012, then we had the Kyoto Protocol that was adopted in this period, and it went on for a second commitment period. The first commitment period happened in 2005, and the second commitment period was negotiated in 2012. And this period is where we saw a lot of work related to ensuring industrialized countries find ways to ensure that they limit their emissions. And this is where schemes like the CDM, came into play because now they were finding market mechanisms to be able to limit their emissions against the targets that they have done, and therefore the opportunity to sell the carbon that was over and above their targets. And then in 2015, there was a landmark moment in climate change, and this is where, in a way, all countries agreed that everybody has a responsibility. Remember, before that, it was seen as an industrialized country problem. They caused the emissions that were in the climate system, and therefore they had a larger responsibility to do put more effort to reduce the emissions. But in 2015, under the leadership of President Obama at the time, COP21 was negotiated, and that was what we call the Paris Agreement. And this is where they agreed that all countries had a responsibility to address climate change, and they needed to all make commitments, and the commitments that they were making were what we call intended nationally determined contribution to what? To reducing climate change. And that was the Paris Agreement. And that has continued to be enforced. And now we are in 2025. Countries have already done their first, what we call NDC, and they are now going into their second cycle of NDC as is required this year. So these are the key timelines, but I'll be elaborating deeper on this, but this is just good for background so that you can understand how the global landscape has been changing over time. It started first with a green, there's an issue, there's need to adapt, but there's also need to reduce emissions, what we call mitigation. Who has the responsibilities? The other question when we discuss the global landscape. And that responsibility was initially with industrialized countries, or what we call Annex I countries. And then eventually in 2015, there was a negotiation that every country saw that they have a responsibility. And so what we've seen is a shift from some parties being given the responsibility and bearing the brunt of climate change to now being a collective global responsibility to all countries to be able to limit global emissions and therefore limit temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius and better yet 1.5. I don't know why my screen keeps getting lines drawn on it. I don't know if it's my mouse. Like I mentioned in 2015, in 2015, countries were required to be able to make commitments. This was against the backdrop of 1,890 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions that were already polluted as at 2011. And so there was IPCC said that there was, for us to limit limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, then we only had a budget of 550 gigatons remaining globally of emissions. That is how much was left for all countries to emit in terms of the carbon budget. So countries made commitments, and the commitments that they were making were up to 2025. And those commitments were found to only be able to achieve collectively 533 gigatons, limit emissions to 533 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which meant that there was a very little budget left for carbon emissions. And then if that was projected further to 2030, they found that the emissions from the INDCs were reaching 500, had exceeded actually the target of 550 by 189, meaning that the commitments countries were making were not sufficient or ambitious enough to reduce emission reductions, given that countries had to limit their to put together their mitigation opportunities. With a 2-degree scenario, the budget was a bit more. It was 1,000 degrees, 1,000 gigatons, sorry, as at 2011, and it was found that by 2025, the 2 degrees, there was 467 gigatons available for countries. We had what had happened is that the emission reduction ambitions that they had set were hitting 533 gigatons, means that we had a carbon budget of 467. And I hope you're understanding what I mean by a carbon budget. Means the amount of carbon that we were left to emit if we do everything that the countries had committed, we still had about 467 gigatons of carbon dioxide that we were in allowance to emit, and that would keep us below 2 degrees. And this is a 66% probability that we would not hit 2 degrees. But as at 2030, that gets lower, meaning that countries were still looking to emit, and there was a chance that we would be able to hit the 2 degrees Celsius before even with a 67% probability before as at 2030. And you can imagine 2 degrees Celsius increment in global temperature means that the world really becomes almost unlivable. And so that is why it has been said that there needs to be rapid and deep actions in changing the way the economies are growing and how we emit to ensure that we keep ourselves, this existential threat is limited. So in this regard, let me deep dive now on the mechanisms for global governance. And like I mentioned, there's the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They become the science that gives evidence that informs politics and economic discourse. And they have been established since 1988. It was established with the World Meteorological Organization because, as you can imagine, a lot of the science is around how the climate system is behaving, but it was also established with UNEP, as you know, that is the UN agency that provides also a lot of evidence on matters environment. It was endorsed by the General Assembly, and so the IPCC became formed to provide this science base. And as you'll see, they have done quite a number of reports, and these reports are developed periodically, with the first one having been developed in 1990, what we call the first assessment report. They are usually very interesting reports. I personally enjoy reading them because they give very strong evidence, because this evidence is collected from different countries, modeled, and then gives a scope of what the globe looks like. And they give very strong, the first assessment report provided a very strong basis for the creation of UNFCCC, like I said, where countries now come together and negotiate a collective goal to be able to advance climate change. So UNFCCC was birthed from the evidence provided in 1990 in the first assessment report that spoke about the need for international cooperation. So when I'm always asked by people, why do you have COP30, COP29, COP26, COP25? I always say it's because climate change is a negotiated process. Because, like I mentioned, it affects politics, it affects economies, it affects culture. So therefore, there has to be international cooperation because it is a sovereign decision. It is not a decision that can be imposed on any country. It will require consensus, cooperation, and that is what the first assessment report showed, that there is a global consequence if there is no cooperation. And for us to advance on addressing climate change, there would be need for international cooperation to address the issue of global warming. At the time, that was the issue that the first assessment report. Then in 1995, there was a second assessment report, and this was very important in providing evidence for the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. This second assessment report gave very detailed information in regards to need for mitigation of emissions, especially from industrialized countries. There was very well computed data that showed and gave evidence that industrialized countries were polluting in a manner that was not sustainable. And so the Kyoto Protocol was then birthed that said that there was need to limit emissions from industrialized countries. In 2001, the third assessment report focused on the impacts of climate change and the need for adaptation, noting that now mitigation had been pronounced in the second assessment report. The third was trying to say, now we are starting to feel the impacts of climate change. It was providing the evidence of what those impacts are in regards to floods, heat waves, droughts, etc., etc. And therefore, they started to raise and amplify the need for adaptation. Now, you will realize that in policy making, evidence is very critical. Why? Because it starts to paint a picture of what is the actual reality on the ground. Hence why I thought best to share this assessment report so that you can see that discourse outside of evidence is not really it's not the way to go in policy making. And so it's very critical that evidence is collected, and that evidence then is used to make decision. And that's why the IPCC reports have been very important, and as you saw, very critical in advancing the global discourse on climate change. What happened in 2007 was the fourth assessment report that came, and this was the groundwork that came that started to paint the picture about limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. The warming past 2 degrees Celsius was modeled, and it started to show that it is actually an existential threat. Life would be very difficult if we pass this 2 degrees Celsius. So the fourth assessment report started becoming the base for what even we are seeing now as the Paris Agreement, because this is the first time we started to see a focus on a limit, a temperature limit that the globe had to commit to. The fifth assessment report then was finalized, and this is the one that was really used to inform the Paris Agreement. So the 2007 report said limit to 2 degrees Celsius, but the fifth assessment report also came and started saying that, climate change is being felt everywhere, and therefore there's a need for a global commitment, because now even developing countries were using fossil fuels and their emissions were starting to contribute also. While not significant at all, they were still contributing to emissions, and therefore there was need for collective responsibility around limiting emissions, and thus limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. In 2023, the sixth assessment report also came into play, and now we started seeing additional pressing for strong, rapid, sustained reductions in carbon dioxide, but also methane and other greenhouse gases. And we've seen additional commitments like the Methane Pact that is saying now we need to do even more to limit methane so that we don't see global warming, greenhouse gases affecting even this 2 degree ambition. So the gist of what I'm trying to paint here is that, policy making, and global policy making at that, requires a strong evidence base. And you can see from here how the IPCC reports have really been critical in defining the agreements that that have been reached globally. And so you can see sequentially, every report has come up with an agreement, has informed an agreement that has been agreed to. The IPCC also has what we call special reports. I picked this one on special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's another special report on the Anthropocene, amongst others. But these reports become very important. Why? Because now they use this to amplify something that may not necessarily be, it's part of the broader report, the normal IPCC report. But if they want to create more attention to an issue, the IPCC issues what we call special reports. By there, for those who may not know, Kenya has an IPCC focal point. They are at the Kenya Meteorological Department, and they are part of the in-country organization of how to collect data that informs these global reports. And for the other countries on the call, Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, you might have an IPCC focal point, and they form the national mechanism through which data is provided. But this special report, like I was saying, was issued to give and amplify the issue around global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was released in 2018, and the report was really trying to speak to what are the emission pathways that can be considered as a global response to climate change, but also paying attention to the need to eradicate poverty and sustainable development. So these are reports that are developed by the IPCC to really put special focus on issues. So some of the things that the IPCC report, special report on 1.5 highlighted was that there's need to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. This will require rapid and far-reaching transitions in our energy system, land systems, food system, urban systems, as well as industrial systems. And so there was this discourse that started to come out of this around green economy and green transition, because then countries start to ask themselves, how are we transitioning our economies, but in a manner that is able to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So these are the reports that center this type of discussion and become the attention of policy, to get the attention of policymakers, including on the proposed solutions to this. So some of the ones that they were proposing is to limit not just CO2 emissions, which needed to reduce by 45% against 2010 levels, but also to limit non-CO2 emissions. And these are the emissions such as nitrous oxide and methane. And this is where you hear issues like livestock. You've had people saying we have to limit livestock eating of meat because of methane. This is how these discussions come into play. When you see such reports, you're told reduce emissions, and then they start to ask, so where are the methane emissions? And they say they are from the belching livestock, and that's how you hear issues around livestock management and stuff like that coming into play. And that causes debate, and that debate then continues and the consensus is reached. The IPCC special report on 1.5 also not only just talked about emission reduction, but also started to talk about the results of warming even at 1.5 degrees. And this is, again, paints a picture of what do you expect if you hit this 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what we saw was that there'll be large-scale drought, famine, heat stress, yeah? We've seen forest fires, loss of habitable land, yeah? So it paints a picture that really politicians can't ignore, let alone the rest of society, because now we start to model what our future can look like if we don't take action. So it paints the picture of inaction, as we like to call it. And here they also highlighted where the impacts would be felt most, and the impacts through this report were mainly in Middle East and Sahel, where already they have water stress. And so, painting a picture that if you don't hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, if we hit the 1.5 degrees Celsius, there are some places in this world that would be unlivable in the Middle East and the Sahel. I want to take a breather here. Do you think pinpointing these challenges in Middle East and Sahel is also a political tool? I'd want to hear your comments. Do you think that it is also a method of IPCC saying, Middle East, you need to reconsider drilling the oil? Anyone wants to chime in?
Yes, you can raise your hand to that. I can see you, then unmute you. Anyone who's contributing to raise their hand up. Yeah, and one is free to unmute.
Anyone want to chime in? Do you think these special reports highlighting specific places is also a political? I see a hand from Adbiogun. Gabriel, you want to come in? Please go ahead. Gabriel Odogun? Yeah.
Permission to speak. I am actually out of I just want to ask a question. As we know that the emission of fossil fuels can only be reduced by some policies put in place by the government. Like my question is that how can afforestation affect the climate positively?
I think I understood the question. You were asking how can afforestation affect climate change? Is that correct, Gabriel?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, it's a good question. There as we know, forestry has been said to be one of the best solution because, as we know, trees are the best source to absorb carbon dioxide, and therefore they do what we call sequestration of carbon. And so, on one hand, afforestation has been said to be good for carbon sinks, right?
Yes.
So it is a positive. It is a positive mitigation tool to reduce carbon emissions. But in your opinion, what is the issue? Because had you heard of arguments where they were saying afforestation is actually bad for the climate?
Can
Gabriel?
I contribute something?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry for interrupting, Gabriel, but I had a different perspective of the IPCC on what you have
Yes.
said about pinpointing on, for example, the area around Middle East, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think basically I can look it at two different points. Like first of all, it can be political. Number one, my reasons being, the Western region has always wanted that most of the energy sources to be coming from them. So Middle East being that producing oil, and that oil is used to manufacture the energy sources around. So they see it as a competition. But coming to think about, the IPCC was an intergovernmental organization meant to curb the climate change. So if we think at that manner, then we also say that you know drilling oils is releasing the fossil fuels. That is also a major challenge on our climate. So when you look at these two different perspectives, then you may realize that both may be contributing to your point that you just asked. But I think that being that IPCC is dealing with the climate change, then it focuses on creating awareness of the environment, the climate specifically. Thank you.
Thank you. I kept losing my unmute button. But yeah, thanks. You know why I raised this question is because, we have to have trust that the IPCC is giving scientifically sound advice to the globe. And so if they find that a region is being affected the most or will be affected the most, we have to trust that they are neutral voice, right? And that they are not trying to participate in politics, but rather are just sharing what the models are showing, what the scientific models are showing. So I wanted to raise this issue because, evidence comes, but evidence without trust does not help in global cooperation, right? If there's a bit of mistrust, then we basically start the conversation as a globe from a place of mistrust, and in essence that means that we can never really reach consensus. However, if everyone agrees that IPCC is a strong scientific arm with representation from all over the globe, and whatever the science shows is what the science shows, then the evidence that provides becomes very pertinent to take into consideration in policy making. So even if they come and say that evidence has shown that there'll be drastic aridity in Middle East and Sahel Africa, they are just saying that's what the evidence shows. What the globe decides to do and what the Middle Eastern countries decide to do with that information becomes now the negotiated process. Right? So you're right, it just gives scientific base. And I just wanted to emphasize here that there's importance in trusting the data. And once that is trusted and it is understood that the IPCC is a neutral body, then we move into negotiations. So now I wanted to share about UNFCCC. Like I said, it was informed by the 1992 the first assessment report in 1990, and it was adopted in 1992 and entered into force in 1994. Do you understand what it means to enter into force? Entering into force basically means that all countries are saying now that is the commitment that we are all following. Yeah. Oyawale Precious, do you want to come in? Feel free.
Yes, ma. But that also has a question that if you reduce this arborist to build a house and
Sorry, there's a bit of background noise. We can just try again. We couldn't hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, ma. Like what I mean is that how can this afforestation work? Because we have to build some things. Like how can this how would I put this? Ma, can you hear me clearly?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, like if we reduce this afforestation, how can we live? Like we have to build a house, then things like that will give people. How would I put it? I don't even know. I think that's the question, Sha.
I missed the question. Are you saying afforestation and building of houses? Say again, please. I think it's an important question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma. Yes, ma.
Alternatively, Precious, you can also type the question, and we'll be able to. I prefer interactive sessions, to be honest, because I know a number of you have been listening to this conversation. So I anticipate that we will have many good questions that will help us have a common understanding. So please go ahead and type in the chat,
okay,
and we'll be able to see the question, because the background noise is disabling us from hearing you. There was someone else who had their hand up.
Yes, madam.
Yes, please go ahead.
I think what Precious is trying to ask is how can we reduce or how can we increase afforestation when we also need raw materials from the forest to build houses?
Yes.
Because
yes.
if we consider this, let's say we reduce on cutting trees for construction and focus on using things like metal. Again, we'll need to mine metal, which causes an increase in emissions. So that's where her question is lined. That's my guess.
I understand it. Yeah, and that's a topic that's very close to my heart. One, wood in itself is a renewable material, and that has been commonly understood. The only issue we have been having, I think, in relation to wood is, as a resource, we have to ensure that it's from sustainably managed forest. The key word being management. So the discourse has really not been do not use wood, even for cooking, by the way. It's just that can you use it in a manner that is sustainable? So for instance, we found that in countries where they have very good management of forests and the use of the forest products, you actually can find that they're having high forest cover. For instance, in Sweden. So we found that, and this is very recent, especially for me because I was participating in this discussion, is that we found that Sweden is promoting the use of wood for construction, engineered wood. And the result has not been a decline in forest cover, but rather an increase in forest cover over time. Why? Because you have created an additional value to the tree, but the tree has to be from sustainably managed forests. So this debate moves from just saying do not use a tree. It's more of do not use a tree if not from a sustainable forest. And if we can even frame it better, it is a push for countries to sustainably manage their forests. I don't know if that answers your question. And we've seen commitments that have been made very recently. For instance, in COP28 in Dubai, Kenya and other 17 countries signed up for the Forest and Climate Leadership Partnership, and they were promoting the use of wood from sustainably managed forests. So it's not about saying do not use wood, it's about use a resource as long as it's sustainably managed, especially renewable sources. I think the push for non-renewable sources is different, but for forests, that would be what I think is the response that I can share for now. Is that okay, Precious? A thumbs up would be good. Okay. If not, we can still come well explained. Okay, super. Yeah. I see even Caroline Ndonguru has also confirmed that we should ensure that we plant and manage the trees well. So, okay, let me now talk about UNFCCC so that we are all in place. So the countries adopted the proposal for the establishment of this UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, and countries agreed, and then it became a global, if you will, law in quotes in 1994. That's what we mean comes into force. It means that now we've agreed, we are bound by this decision starting 1994, not 1992. And so the countries agreed, one, that there will be non-binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions for individual countries, and there was no enforcement mechanism that was in place. You'll see how this changed over time, but basically they were agreeing to how countries can agree and have protocols to share, and the goal that they all commonly agreed to is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to a level that would prevent human interference, anthropogenic human interference with the climate system. And then UNFCCC established the Conference of Parties as the supreme decision-making organ. The Conference of Parties is basically all countries that are part of the convention become, what we call a party. They're the participants in the decision making, and so the COP, the word COP, as you've heard common people saying, I'm going for COP 27 in Egypt, COP 29 in Azerbaijan, etc. It's basically the Conference of Parties. But the Conference of Parties also has what would I call them? They have bodies that help in its decision making, and these parties meet in June, usually around June, July, in Bonn to discuss. And these are there are three bodies: the subsidiary body for technology and science advice. These are the ones who look at the issues related to science on greenhouse gas emissions, what is the current trend, etc., and they make a decision on what will happen in that regard. Then you have the other body that discusses now implementation. How are we doing in terms of finance? How are we doing in terms of knowledge and capacity building? What is being done to enable countries to have technology that they require? So this is the body that really discusses matters related to implementation of the decisions. Then they have ad hoc working groups that are set up from time to time to handle special areas. For instance, they can have an adaptation committee, a technology committee, amongst others. So they usually have a media meeting that I mentioned that is really technical, and these are the ones that then, you have technical officers. If you're in a country, you might have your climate change departments, their directors, etc., that go to Bonn, usually mid-year, and they participate in these technical negotiations. And then end year is when you start to see all the presidents, all the ministers meet in this bigger meeting, and this is where they discuss the negotiation. So for Kenya, where I'm from, the convention was ratified and made into national law in 1994. Then in 1997, we saw a change from non-binding obligations to legally binding obligations, and this was through the Kyoto Protocol. It was adopted in 1997, but took 10 years to enter into force. And this, I guess, was because of this binding obligation, and it was for developed countries. So the commitment period for the Kyoto Protocol, there have been two. The first commitment period is to commit to the emission reduction obligations between 2008 and 2012. And then there was a second commitment period that was entered into from 2013 to 2020. And this is where we saw a lot of this carbon trading discussion peak, because the Sorry. And this is where we started to see countries that are called Annex I, because they are in the first annex of the decision, being given responsibility for historical emissions that had been experienced since the industrial age. The Kyoto Protocol was very controversial in the sense for especially developed countries, because now they started to be put on the spot for emission reductions, and that's why there's a lot of politics around Kyoto Protocol. And the focus was really on mitigation, not on adaptation. And so countries were really fighting the Kyoto Protocol because one, there was a economic implication. Countries had to finance emission reductions because they were legally bound to. That's why I was saying you started to see a lot of issues around clean development mechanism, which is a carbon trading mechanism. Because in Europe, for instance, they did what was called a cap. They limit emissions. They say you cannot pass, let me give an example. They say don't pass 50 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. So if you pass the 50 tons of carbon dioxide emissions, you are to find a way to pay for that emission above that 50 tons of emission. So if you got 70, you had to be able to pay for the 20 tons above the limit that you have. So countries started to have this type of caps, and then we started to see them having market mechanisms to address that additional emissions that they were facing. So it was legally binding, and this became a hot political issue. And so, as you can imagine, developed countries were, of course, they would be, they want to limit emissions, but it's painful. It's very painful. And so they were very keen to negotiate out of it. Yeah, so there was a lot of championship, but there was also countries that were saying, we don't want to be part of these. Countries like China, US, were really fighting the Kyoto Protocol. So for instance, the United States signed the Kyoto Protocol in 1998, but it didn't ratify it. So you can sign, but as long as you don't ratify, it means that you've gone back to your country and they said, no, we are not taking this as a law. It's not going to be legally binding. So the US, for instance, the Senate of the US in 1997 said that they disapprove entering in a treaty that did not include binding commitments for developing countries. And which countries were they pointing at? China. So you can start to see the politics. The US and China always have a lot of issues, but China was not in the Annex I of the Kyoto Protocol, so of UNFCCC, so they could not be bound because the binding was for Annex I countries. China was listed as a non-Annex I or developing country. So President Bush rejected the Kyoto Protocol, and therefore US completely disengaged from the Kyoto Protocol, which becomes a very big issue. Because other countries will say, if US, that is number 4 emitter, or number 2 emitter, or number 3 is not participating, why should we be bound? Isn't it unfair? So countries start to say, no, then we'll do it on our own. Let's not participate in this global agreement because we can't have this almost unfairness. And remember, like I mentioned, sovereignty is a major issue when it comes to climate discourse. So the negotiations for the second Kyoto Protocol started to happen, and here they were really hopeful that the US will come on board. And so this happened in 2005, and they established a working group to discuss the commitment. Sorry, give me a minute. Let me just. So they started discussing the second commitment period, and here still we didn't see a lot of commitments from the UN. And so the fourth assessment report came out. Like I told you, the IPCC creates that evidence base. And the working group then said that, you know, there's need to have a convention that gives long-term cooperation. Otherwise, if we have these commitment periods that are short, then we don't have consensus, and that means we have a threat to not being able to achieve a collective goal. And so there were very many COPs that presented commitments but they were not successful in bringing everybody on board. We still saw resistance from the US. Canada also had some foot in, foot out. Other countries as well were not fully in the agreement. And so what happened was that, you know, they agreed, let's negotiate a whole new agreement. And this is when we started seeing the path to Paris Agreement that was discussed in COP15. In COP21, sorry, in 2015. So COP21 was based on the negotiations that happened here in Africa, in South Africa in particular. The ad hoc working group on the Durban platform discussed a protocol. We're really trying to put a protocol together, a legal instrument that would put into force all parties, forcing all parties to be part of a global commitment. And this is when President Obama became a champion, because he became the rallying voice for all countries to come together through this commitment that was made, called the Paris Agreement, that was signed in 2015. I believe there were only 2 countries that didn't sign at the time, and those was the countries that were facing war, Yemen and I think Somalia at the time, but Somalia also signed the Paris Agreement eventually. But so it was seen as a very successful negotiation process, because now we saw all countries coming on board and saying, yes, we can contribute to climate action. And so they made these commitments through what we call intended nationally determined contributions. So for the countries that are here, I believe most countries in Africa have what's the word for it? Have submitted INDCs. Either in 2015, Kenya submitted its intention in 2015 and ratified that after the agreement was signed. This is where countries were saying, okay, this is what we can do to reduce emissions. But for Kenya, we said we will not just do emission reduction. We are a developing country. And so there was need for also a So the intended nationally determined contribution made the everybody a playing field, and this has been seen has received mixed reactions, because developing countries are still very low in emissions, right? So why should we have an equal playing field? On one hand, it is very good because every country participates in this in this global discourse here, but at the same time, we have to have differentiated responsibilities. So in as much as all countries have committed, there's still the discussion and the debate around who should pay for the brunt of climate change, and developed countries continue to be held to account on that. So the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. It entered into force in 2016, and it really was aimed. The goal is to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, with efforts to keep it at 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. And this also says it also has very interesting commitment, because it says, in as much as we are reducing emissions, we should do it in a manner that does not threaten food production. And there needs to be finance flows consistent to ensure that countries are able to finance climate action. So for Kenya, we signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, and 1 year later we ratified it, meaning that Kenya acknowledged it as law, and it was Parliament that said, fine, we are happy with the commitment. So the Paris Agreement is implemented through, apologies, I don't know what something has made me have allergies. So if my voice sounds a bit nasal, kindly excuse me. The Paris Agreement is implemented through nationally determined contributions. So the graphs I showed you earlier are the commitments, what those commitments translate to in terms of emission reductions, and it applies to both developed and developing countries. So for Kenya, they say the emissions at the what we call business as usual scenario, when doing nothing, was 143 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And these are from the energy sector, transport sector, industrial, agricultural, forestry, land use, and waste sectors. And so Kenya was saying if it does renewable energy through, for instance, geothermal deployment, changing the cargo transport from road to rail, or if they do cement processes are changed, tweaked a little bit to make them low carbon. And if they have organic, waste management to ensure that you manage organic waste, etc., then they would be able to reduce emissions by 30% relative to its business as usual scenario. And so this is the first commitment it made. And that commitment was then further, they make another caveat and say, we will only achieve this 30% reduction if we get international support in form of what? Finance, investment, technology transfer, capacity building. So this is what we call an intentional, a conditional NDC. Fast forward to 2020, the country updated its NDC, and now that 30 has changed to 32, and Kenya said, look, we have seen that we can even finance this from our exchequer, and so they made it partially conditional, because now Kenya said the 32% will be able to remove 13% of that budget from our own public resources. So the NDC becomes a very good framework for implementing the NDC. But now we are at an interesting, we are having an interesting debate. One, for those of you who so we had in 2023 the Africa Climate Summit. Was it 2023 or yeah? Anyway, the Africa Climate Summit, and President Ruto, who is the chair of the African Union Committee on Climate Change, he led other countries in saying that, for long we have been positioning ourselves as victims and in need of finance flows, yet climate change is also an opportunity. The minerals that will be required for electric mobility, the arable land globally, a lot of it is still in Africa. We are a developing, our country is still developing, our countries are still developing. We have huge percentage of youth that are available to work. So how can we reframe and participate in this discourse as the ones who are offering what? Solutions. And then we also have had very interesting announcements. I like to say it as drill, baby, drill. So I want to end here by saying, are we threatened now with our ambition as Africa versus pronouncements by countries like America, or do we stay the course? Do you think that now climate change negotiations will collapse this year in Brazil, or do you think that the globe will still move with determination? I want to end with that. I know I don't want to do death by PowerPoint, so allow me to stop here and allow for us to reflect on what do you think about these two images, the Africa Climate Summit and the US pronouncement.
What is it?
That's the issue that we have with Zoom, the children. Anyone wants to give a reflection so that we can end?
On the chat, I can see there are various questions.
Let me stop sharing.
Maybe
Does Margaret want to go as we go through the chat questions? Margaret, maybe?
Margaret, you can unmute.
Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I have a question, Madam. According to UN Climate Change Conference 26, no country is currently on track to meet the goals of Paris Agreement. So now, is there a hope that we will be able to address the climate change before it's too late? Because now we see that the climate change is one of the major of the burning issue worldwide. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe Mahmuda, before I come in, you can also contribute.
Yes, ma'am. My question is, with intergovernmental law and legislation against climate change, what are the strategies for the policy implementation?
Yeah. Okay, good
Yes, ma'am.
question.
That's my
Fabian,
question.
thank you so much. Fabian, you can go ahead. I'll take the four of you and then we'll discuss.
Okay, once again, I've got a thing to contribute on what you've said. You know, the President Donald Trump withdrawing from the Paris Agreement has impacted on Africans financially because we depended on the US for funding of certain activities to take place, but now it has affected us. That doesn't mean that we should now stop the climate change initiative. So I had some questions that during the conversation, during the interaction, I noted down. So number one question is that being that you are already in the climate change initiative, a governmental organization, what are the latest advancements in carbon capture and storage technology? We know that once carbon is released in the environment, I think with the rising technology, I know there are a lot of mitigations that have been employed. For example, the new technology of. So my question was, what are the latest advancements in carbon capture and damage technologies? And also, you know, as students, undergraduates, we usually do use perfumes a lot, and perfume is an aerosol. Do you think it has got impact on climate change? So, and
Yeah,
also, my third question is,
yeah.
you know, for example, I come from PC. I'm based in PC University, so there's there is a rising temperature. So there's let me say a conspiracy theory that once a temperature increases, you tend to feel some heat on, like you experience certain headaches. So it is. So my question comes from okay, let me put it this way: how do rising temperature affect the spread of vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue? So thank you.
Thank you. Let me come first to those before I invite Maureen. Very good contributions. I was laughing and saying, "Oh no, don't touch the perfumes, please, women. Do you feel me? You can't touch the perfumes, please. We have already been told not to eat meat." But yeah, I think the gist of it is to identify things that can really, at scale, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? So we do not want to be able to. I think one of the themes in a political discourse is you pick the imperatives first. Yeah, if you want to bring everyone on the same page, it can be a personal decision to do something like perfumes, for instance. Not that I've seen them proven to cause greenhouse gas emissions. I really hope they are not. Maybe I'll compute, but the emissions that have to reduce, because you can see it has to be deep emission reduction. So they usually pick those which have high scale in emission reduction. So for instance, forestry sector. Yeah. So we've seen, for instance, I saw a lot of debate on Ghana in the chat, and we've seen that, for instance, the commodities like palm, or even cocoa, I think they touched a bit on that, were not done sustainably, leads to large scale deforestation, because you have to clear a lot of land to have some of these species grown, and when the species are grown, they are cut again in large scale. And so what you have is a lot of that was happening in places like the Amazon, etc. And so you're having large scale deforestation, large scale land use change for forests, for farming. And so the debate has been, how can we have emission reductions from activities that are large scale? Yeah. And so at an individual level, one can say, okay, fine, I'll reduce my emission footprint. But for the global discourse, we ask ourselves around that which many people are participating in, and large scale emissions are being done. So there's been a lot of advancement in identifying those sources of emissions. You highlighted carbon capture and storage. Now we are seeing carbon capture storage, a lot of engineering work going into it. Some are already being tested, like here in Kenya, there are some which are being tested. There's financing that is going to such technologies. There's debates that are going as to whether these technologies are even causing a change in our geological stability. So this is the world of climate change. Climate change is a problem. People have to innovate solutions. So what happens is, as you innovate, you come and argue, this innovation of mine, it's scalable, it can cause emission reductions or sequester emissions to this regard. How can it be financed? How can there be technology deployment at scale? Etc. Fabian. So for the UN, we are now looking at a lot of work in relation to how do we ensure that we finance innovations. Yeah, how do we ensure that we finance innovations that university students are coming up with, private sector, etc., that are able to support efforts to reduce and become resilient to climate change. And that is the ecosystem that the UN comes into play. The UN is an intergovernmental organization that tries to amplify, so bring voice to issues that need global attention. And so the UN, for instance, UNDP, we do a lot in financing communities. We do funding of biodiversity conservation work. We fund government to deploy at scale. So like UNDP did the first studies for geothermal in 1950 something in Kenya, and now geothermal has become one of the largest sources of energy in Kenya. So that's what the UN does. But now we are seeing additional work from private sector, and this is actually what we are saying needs to happen more and more, because private sector innovate, private sector have capital, they have skills, they have manpower, they can deploy and support these efforts that the globe is putting together. So I hope that answers your question, Fabian. I think the other questions that have been raised have been more, Fabian, you say you've understood. I'm happy. Maybe I can give Maureen and Cynthia, and then we can move into to winding down. Maureen?
My question would be, when it comes to carbon credit, is there a standard carbon accounting that ensures that the company don't emit beyond the carbon credit that we have been given? And then allowing them to sell the excess carbon credit, does then that promote emission of greenhouse gases, and rather than reducing the set amount?
Yeah, that's a good question, Maureen, and very interesting. I think the carbon, first to say and clarify is that the whole carbon credit, carbon market mechanism is supposed to be a disincentive to emissions. So since you've decided to emit, pay for that emission. So it's supposed to be a pinch to those who emit. So it's actually supposed to discourage emission reductions, because some people are saying my process cannot change radically to reducing emissions. So what's supposed to happen, and maybe a whole lecture on carbon markets, is you're supposed to go and pay for those who can do something to reduce emissions. And then it becomes a numbers game. Yours is adding, mine is subtracting. When we do the math, it should be a net reduction. I don't know, Maureen, if you've gotten that. So in essence, the carbon emission, the whole carbon, what's the word for it? The whole carbon markets scheme is supposed to discourage those who emit. Is there a common standard? There are several common standards that exist. So there are companies like Gold Standard, Vera, and this is because for carbon, you want to ensure that you're comparing apples for apples and not apples for oranges, to make sure that the standards are a must. And so every carbon project that you see subscribes to a standard that confirms, and that's why you have a rigorous process of verification. But as you know, they'll always have their challenges, because people can always cheat on the numbers. people can always do this, and that's why issues around verification and transparency and accountability are a very big topic when it comes to carbon markets. So allow me to stop there, Maureen. In case you've not understood, please put on the chat and I'll be able to send you something. I see a thumbs up. Thank you. Cynthia?
Hello, thank you so much. So my question is, we have seen a rise in the transport sector contributes so much in carbon emissions. And as at now, Kenya embraces electric mobility. For instance, there are electric bicycles and also motorcycles. So my question is, how can we balance the shift between the electrical vehicles and non-motorized transport, at the same time considering our limited infrastructure? And also, what are some of the strategies that we can use to ensure that we manage the environmental risks of the depleted lithium-ion batteries, which contributes also to the waste challenge? Thank you.
Yeah. No, very good question. I think for mobility, everyone is trying to see how do we move from this internal combustion engine to sources that can help people move and move fast. Remember, people want to move fast. Yeah, watu wa Nairobi, people from Nairobi, you know how you like to move very fast. And so there's that. Then, like we said, climate change is it's an economic debate. When we talk about transport sector, transport facilitates economic activity. It enables you to move from place to place, goods to move from place to place, and therefore the discourse has always been, how can we ensure that we enable movement without emitting? Because the diesel petrol engines have really been a source of emissions, right? And now you bring in a very good debate. Now we've said, let's go electric. The next question is electric. What about the footprint of electric? And now we are seeing debates around the batteries, like you rightly said, Cynthia. And so as we innovate, one of the anticipations is we'll always come up with challenges. And as we come up with challenges, that's when we even innovate around those challenges. Now the new challenge has been on the battery. And so what we are starting to see are people asking questions like, can we use green hydrogen? I don't know if you've heard about that and other sources. So I think the climate debate opens up new Pandora's boxes, and for human beings, that's the norm of innovation cycles. We have to find new challenges and then find new solutions to those challenges, because those challenges were not envisioned before even the solution was brought into place, Cynthia. So for countries like Kenya, non-motorized transport is a priority. I think we live in cities that are not very mobility friendly, if there's a word like that. We can walk to places, but we don't have very nice walking lanes, for instance, or bicycle lanes, etc. And so that becomes a major challenge to addressing our whole mobility issues. So I think the debates for Kenya is that how do we have, and other countries in Africa, is how do we have integrated solutions that are able to ensure that we allow for efficient movement of goods and people at the same time in a manner that is low carbon. And that's the discussion that is going on. And I think that what you're bringing up on board, including on the issues of the battery, is a debate that is now picking up, because now we are trying to address the whole challenge around the diesel engine. So let me end by speaking on this issue on forestry, because it's very close to my heart. I am part of a team in Kenya that is now trying to promote the use of wood products from sustainably managed forests. And I think for Africa countries, we have to take cognizance that we live in a very rich ecosystems. And these natural resources are there for us to use, right? And if we always have this old mentality that do not use this resource, we are also failing ourselves. And that's why I like the debate that's happening in the chat, where they are saying, okay, in Ghana, our people need these trees. for economic activity. And that's, I am in full agreement with you. And that's why we are saying we have to use these resources, but we also have to do them in a responsible manner and also increase the value of what we are removing from the tree. So for instance, burning a tree for charcoal, it is such a low value, it's such a low value use of that tree. But if we are able to innovate, you've seen countries like China, countries like Canada, countries like India, they're innovating additional value from the tree, where you have high products like cocoa, rubber, etc. These are good. Sustainable forest management has to come in play. So I'm really for the notion that we should not see these resources as resources that should be there to stand. You get what I mean? It's not just supposed to be there to stand. It's there to be used. I believe God gave us these resources for us to use. But what we need to do is manage the resource so that it can be there for other generations. I think that is where the bone of contention has been. And I think that we need to start discussing how can we ensure that we develop sustainably, but use the resources God has put to us. Otherwise, with that, let me stop here. I think I've shot over time, and unfortunately, I also have another call. Let me hand over to the organizers so that we can wind down. And thank you so much for being such a engaging class. Asanteni.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. That was quite insightful. And the fact that we've ended at a point where we are talking of using resources sustainably than just behaviorally conservative, that there is no use of this resource, and which I think is a good debate on issues of sustainability. We are very grateful for the presentation, and I think before I take it back to Mwangi, I would just want to appreciate your time and the presentation. That was very good, and for us from the Acclimatise project, I think this is a very good presentation, which put into focus how then the whole global governance landscape and issues of sustainability in the context of the debate on climate change and issues of carbon. So we are really, really grateful, Yvonne. Thank you for joining us. So I take it back to Mwangi. Mwangi, go.
It was a very insightful session. Thank you, Yvonne, for your time and for sharing the knowledge with us. Those who aren't able to join, there will be a recording that will be uploaded tomorrow. Yeah, I think that's it. And maybe thank you also for engaging on our social media platforms. The recent posts have gained good traction. And yeah, thank you for that. I think that's it. We can now end the meeting.